This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien for this week's grain market update. He shares the wheat markets were quite tumultuous in the last week and compares corn and soybean prices and what that might mean for acres planted later this year. We are also joined by the State Extension Food Safety Specialist for both K-State and the University of Missouri, Londa Nwadike, for a segment on preparing to sell at farmers markets. She shares information on the importance of farmers markets, considerations when getting started, and a webinar series that will be taking place all of next week with more information on this area. We end this week's programming with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip shares highlights of the past week's weather, current soil conditions in light of recent precipitation, and what we can expect to see in the week ahead. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien for this week's grain market update. As always, we're going to start with our futures and cash prices that we've seen over the past week or so. And Dan, this week's been a bit of a tumultuous one, right?
Yes, the price volatility, I guess especially for wheat, we've seen some upward movement. And after a good long time of prices not being very positive here now for the last 5 to 10 trading days, we've come up from basically from a low of about $8 now up to about $8.80 and 3/4, having traded up near, getting closer to $9. So that is a change in attitude and narrative in the market. Part of that has come from stronger exports. For the week ending the 26th of January, we had about 18 million bushels of U.S. wheat exports total, and that's pretty near the USDA pace that's needed to meet their projections, particularly for hard red winter wheat. We'd been struggling along at 1 or 2 or 3 million bushels and did jump up to over 5 in that time frame. And the thing that's been holding the wheat market back has been at least credited to have been strong Russian sales. Of course, they had all of their wheat they're projecting, and it seems like in the areas they occupied in Ukraine, those wheat supplies were available to them. Those probably have gone too, although there's lots of controversy over that. And any wheat that Ukraine had there with their low currency, they're basically, and as I've talked about in the ag press, they're talking about fire sale prices. Basically, they want to move it. They need the currency. So you've got all that happening and really sort of being at the front of a lot of world markets. Well, you get to the place where eventually those supplies aren't as plentiful. You work them down some. And now it's early February now, and we're 1 month away from breaking dormancy for wheat. Some areas of western Kansas have moisture, others don't. Some areas have snow cover and others don't. So cold temperatures and that are all of concern. So you wonder what's happening tumultuously in the futures. A lot of it's been happening in the wheat market. I would say that we're almost now for soybean futures. We build in this trend, literally an expectation of continued higher prices. And we closed yesterday at $15.34 for the March lead futures contract. Certainly a trend up over the last bit of time. If you look at the weekly futures, we've been trending up basically from a low of $13.50 back in October of 2022 in kind of somewhat of a tortured path, but still, stand back and look at it, fairly consistent. Now we've worked our way up, same 15.28, 15.30 that we were talking about. So a lot of that, I think, is credited to worries about Argentina, as you and I have talked about. They've had some rains. Are they enough to offset all the damage they had earlier? We'll see. So that's the main underlying unsettling factor that's held up the soybean market. The corn market, if anything, we've almost had less excitement in the corn than you'd almost expect, given all that was happening in the last bit of time. So we closed yesterday at 675 and a quarter and have been really just sort of slowly moving around. If there's a word in the country that's being talked about, it's that, hey, people must have their needs met for now. And I don't doubt that. If we had more clamoring to get to gain control of any local supplies or anything still in storage, we'd see even stronger basis than we're at. But at least we don't for this time. I still hold the question out as to where we'll be once we get into the summer, and maybe the supplies that we have right now apparently are getting closer to being done. So we'll see where that goes. So I would say that these price trends that we're in, I guess I have in mind my general paradigm that historically most of our price strength has come in the last 5 to 10 years during May and June. And if we have short crops from there, we tend to go sideways to lower. And if we have big crops, we go lower more strongly into harvest. But here we are now in February, and a lot of times February does show, historically, it's a pretty narrow trading range month, moving higher for corn and for soybeans. For wheat, a lot of times it's moving sideways, a little bit of volatility breaking dormancy if we have weather issues heading into March. But generally, we move sideways to a little bit higher coming through February. But then once we get in the fields, we start worrying about moisture and ability to fertilize, get things planted, then we have a lot more movement. So I guess any movement that we're seeing now, like we're seeing in soybeans, is, I wouldn't say it's a gift, but it's contrary to what we normally see happening in these markets in Kansas over time. So that we're not falling off is probably indicative of just how tight supply-demand situation is around the world. And so now when we don't have a lot happening, we go sideways. And in some past years, we didn't have a lot happening, we go down. So we're going sideways right now just because there's not a lot of new news yet.
Yeah, I guess which option you would choose there. I'd say we're in pretty good conditions considering the alternative. Yeah. So great coverage there of futures. And are cash markets kind of following the same trends? Are we seeing that play out locally as well?
Well, with the move higher in the wheat markets, we have seen 30, 40 plus cents improvement in cash wheat prices. I don't know who still has wheat. I think commercials probably still have wheat in storage in elevators, but I'm not sure how many farmers still have wheat. But, you're seeing now wheat prices very consistently running from a low in southeast Kansas, and we're taking the high prices in these different regions. So the highest of the elevator bids around the Columbus area, $8.22 on the low side. So again, well over $8, moving up to as high as $8.75 in Salina, $8.65 in Hutchinson. And of course, those are major export milling areas. Topeka, $8.55, $8.56, Garden City, $8.48 in Colby. So all good. Producers are probably now wondering what their production prospects are. And if they think they have good subsoil, if they're pretty confident about where the market's going, new crop bids, basically the lowest new crop bid in these same locations is $7.97, and the highest ones are basically $8.30 in Topeka and Garden City. So interesting that Garden City isn't a major milling center or even a major historic transport center for wheat in Kansas, but it's tied for the highest price right now, along with Topeka for movement. So I guess the dryness down there and the thirst for feedable grain is probably playing into that.
Absolutely. And I know that we can anticipate potentially some more volatility to come in 2 weeks or so. Yeah. And that's specifically because of the USDA Outlook Conference that's going on in D.C., which you will be in attendance of. So tell us a bit about that. Myself
and Guy Allen will be there. And that conference is most of the time the first public rollout of what the USDA's projections are for the coming year. And they do give a preliminary view of that and put that out in November. And my take is that the USDA starts out conservative, and where the acres are not on the low side for most of these commodities, the yields tend to be on the high side, and the prices are not that terribly high. For instance, their numbers for corn that they already have put out preliminary to that conference, showing a planted area of about 92 million acres. That would be up some. So raised their corn planted acres from 88, 89 up to 92. So they're indicating, looks like people are going to plant corn. On their soybean numbers, they're essentially sideways for soybeans. No real change at all or just marginal. So in their view, U.S. corn farmers, if they increase anything, they'll probably go with corn. And if you look at the soybean corn price ratio right now, it's about 2.35, something like that. And our long-term average is about 2.52. So that favors, with soybean prices, new crop bids are lower relative to corn, that favors soybeans. I guess without getting too lost in the weeds on this, they tend to project high trend line yields for these crops and come in on the high side on production aspects. They're already dialing in 181 and a half bushels per acre for their projection, and we haven't ever really had above 177. So that's a number to watch, we'll say, to be polite on that. So with all that, they are plugging in a price by the time they work all the way through their supply-demand balance sheets of about $5.70. Right now, the futures are projecting about 640, 645. So there's a variance between the USDA's more conservative projection and what the futures markets are implicitly projecting for the coming year. And for soybeans, the USDA has projected about $13 per bushel for the coming year. That'd be 2023-24 marketing year. And futures, by the time we look at that, they're somewhat higher. Our own KSU numbers are closer to 14.5 to 15. So I'm really curious about having a KSU contingent at that conference and to talk with these people one-on-one and to get, yes, I see what their numbers are that they put out, but I really would like to understand their true feelings about where the risks are this year and if their numbers are wrong, what direction are we likely to go into?
Great opportunity to network with some fellow economists from across the country and to get insight, like you said.
I hope that we could gain some insights on what they think is coming out of these international conflicts. How much recovery do they foresee in Ukraine? We're sort of easing our way into saying that, well, we think we're going to be down 20, 30, 40% or more, in the long run. It's not just what happened this year in a war-torn year. What do they come out of this with? And how does the world corn market change because of the damage done to the Ukrainian corn and wheat producing capacity? And it's been substantial, not just production, but also, as we've seen, on the export side. So lots of issues. I personally think that damage will lead to even tighter stocks for those crops. We've lost some proportion of our production capacity, but especially our export competitiveness out in the world. And it's not that we're not competitive, we've lost competitors. So for who's left, we'll tend to hold up prices all that much more.
Sure. Yeah. Long-term effects we can expect to see from that for sure. But Dan, as always, thank you so much for your time. And like I said, we'll hear hopefully from you during that conference. We'll see the setup, how the timeline lays out, but hopefully we'll hear from you while you are actually there and then follow up in the weeks ahead too after that. So looking forward to that.
Thank you. We'll sure try to make that happen if we can, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien joining us for this week's grain market update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Londa Nwadike. She is a state extension food safety specialist for both K-State and the University of Missouri. And she's joining us today for a conversation on preparing to sell at farmers markets. So before we get into that, Londa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. We're happy to have you. And like I said, we're going to be chatting about farmers markets today. So I guess to start off our conversation, we can kind of start with the significance of farmers markets in our communities.
Yeah, farmers markets are definitely a great asset to our communities for many reasons. It's a source of local food that people can go to get fresh tomatoes, fresh cantaloupe, baked goods, and just a variety of foods that are made by the community. And then it's also a great way for people that are wanting to sell, whether it's fruits and vegetables or canned foods or baked goods or, whatever the product might be. It's a great kind of way for them to get started in selling their products. So it's often kind of an entry to consumer marketing that producers can use.
Absolutely. A wonderful opportunity for sure, and a way to get more plugged in with your community as well, just to get to know people better and talk about agriculture, such a fun subject to cover, obviously. And when it comes to considering getting into farmers markets, if someone's, debating whether or not that's something they're interested in, why should some producers, you kind of hinted at it there, it's a good starting point. Why should they be willing to get their foot in the door?
Yeah. So, farmers markets can be kind of a way for producers to be able to start learning about their customers a little more. It's kind of offers a chance for them to interact with their customers. So, not only can you sell product, obviously, it's a good way to bring, a number of interested people together to one place at a certain time. But it's also, a way that the producer can talk to the consumer and ask them and find out more of what they're looking for. Like maybe they really want this certain variety of some fruit or vegetable or something, then you can start to grow that or something, or they really like this bread, but they really would like it spicier. So I can make it spicier or something like that. So you can gain, producers can gain product feedback. And it's also a nice way for producers to meet other producers in the area. You could meet the other vendors and, so it's also, again, just a way that you don't have to have a lot of capital investment, or as much capital investment. You don't have to have a huge supply to sell to, marketing channels that might require more supply. It's a way that you can get started with, maybe incrementally, little by little.
Wonderful. Yeah, a good stepping stone for sure for many. And whenever producers are thinking about getting started in this area, I'm sure there's lots of considerations before you even think about it. So what are some of those things that people should be thinking about before they even start selling at a farmer's market?
Right. So I work in food safety, so that's the area that I always think about right away. But, when you're selling at a farmer's market, you want to make sure that you are meeting regulations, any food safety regulations that might be there. And there's a number of things that do not require a license to be sold at a farmer's market. We actually have a publication that we put out every year. We work together with the Kansas Department of Ag to update it every year. So every year we add the latest questions that we get from people, so it's current. I feel like it's a pretty comprehensive list of lots of different food products. Does it need a license or not? What type of licensing? What type of steps do you need to take to make sure that the product is as safe as possible? So that's the first thing that I think about, is to make sure that whatever you're selling at the market is, is allowed to be sold without a license, or if it needs a license, that I have that in place. Then you also have to think about collecting and remitting sales tax. So sales tax is, again, that's what helps fund our schools and funds roads and all those things. So, and as a vendor, it's important that you do collect and remit that sales tax. So Kansas just changed its food sales tax requirements this year. So actually, we have a webinar series coming up next week as I'm speaking. It's February 6th through the 10th. It's from noon to 1 Central Time each day. And on different days of the webinar series, we'll be covering different topics. So actually, that webinar series would be a great way to kind of learn about all the different things that are required. So on Wednesday, February 8th, we'll be covering Kansas sales tax. And so vendors can learn more about how they would collect and remit sales tax to the state. So on Thursday, February 9th, is the day that we'll be covering like food safety regulations. So anybody that's selling anything other than meat and poultry, basically, those regulations would be covered on Thursday, February 9th. And we'll also have a presentation from the Kansas Value-Added Foods Lab within K-State Extension, who can help you if you do need to get nutrition facts on your label, or if you're selling a canned food that might need a process authority letter, they can help you with that. So that's on Thursday, February 9th. On Tuesday, February 7th is the day that we're covering meat and poultry regulations. So if you're selling meat or poultry and eggs as well, that will be covered on Tuesday, February 7th. We'll also have a presentation from the Kansas Value-Added Meats Lab on that day. On Monday, February 6th, is the first day of our webinar series. And that day, we'll be talking about how farmers markets and any direct-to-consumer sales. So this webinar series that we have, it also covers things like farm stands and CSAs to some extent, and other, internet sales. So any direct-to-consumer sale where you as the producer are you know who the buyer, who the consumer of that food is. That's what we call direct to consumer. And the regulations are different if you're direct to consumer or if you're selling through a wholesaler. So that's the differentiation. But so on Monday, February 6th, we'll be talking about how farmers markets and then other like farm stands, et cetera, can accept SNAP. It's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So low-income individuals can utilize that SNAP program to be able to access more foods. So on Monday, February 6th, we'll be talking about how to accept SNAP. And then we'll also be talking about the Double Up Food Bucks program, which is a program that K-State Research and Extension is working with a number of other partners to implement across Kansas. And so that Double Up Food Bucks program can double the amount of money that SNAP recipients can spend on fresh fruits and vegetables at farmers markets and farm stands. So that's a great program. And then on Friday, February 10th, the Kansas Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program will be covered. And so that program enables senior citizens, and there's an income requirement, a low income requirement for that too. So Kansas senior citizens can get vouchers to be able to purchase more fruits and vegetables at the market. So if you as a vendor want to accept that Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program vouchers, you have to be trained. This year, Kansas Department of Health is requiring that all people that are accepting those Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program vouchers, that they are all trained. In the past, sometimes they would only require new vendors to get that training, but now every new and returning vendors have to get that training if they want to accept those vouchers. So those are things to think about if you're selling at a farmer's market, and then also some resources that are available if you're selling at a farmer's market, ways that you can make, more income, you can have more sales as well through some of those different programs that I mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great opportunities there for sure. And we'll link to all of those in the show notes of today's show, which can be found on agtoday.net as always. And like you said, great learning experiences that are going to be offered all next week. So listeners, if this is something that you're interested in an area you're wanting to learn more about, take advantage of that opportunity for sure. And if listeners are, also thinking about, well, I know this will probably be covered in the webinar series next week as well, but if I don't even know where to start or how to even find a farmer's market to sell at, what is your advice for people in that kind of boat?
Good question. So the publication that I mentioned earlier, our MF 3138 publication, does have some information on just all of what I just talked about, not just the food safety regulations, but we have a key context list on that publication that, helps you to know even things like if you want to become an LLC or, your business licensing and registering with the Secretary of State, that sort of thing. Like we have all that information in that publication as well. So that publication can kind of help you with all those different things. The question of where to find a farmer's market is a good one. Kansas Department of Agriculture from the Land of Kansas program has they do have a central registry of farmers markets in Kansas. And so they do have a website that has more information about farmers markets in Kansas. And then they have information on the workshops specifically on that website also. So that's one place that you can go to find different farmers markets across the state. And, word of mouth, of course, is another way, you can ask around. The Kansas Department of Ag's website really would be it's probably the most official list, I guess, of farmers markets in the state. So.
Excellent. Well, another great resource for sure, Londa, and I'll link to that as well in our show notes because you've mentioned the publication now, this webinar series and the KDA website for that comprehensive list. So all great, excellent resources. But Londa, thank you so much for being another great resource today. I appreciate you joining us to have this conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. Happy to help. And if you have questions related to food safety and or farmers markets, I'm happy to help with that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Once again, everyone, that was Londa Nwadike. She serves as a state extension food safety specialist for both K-State and the University of Missouri. Joining us for a conversation on farmers markets. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we return, we'll be back with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. He's rounding out this week's programming, of course, with this week's agricultural weather report, where he'll recount the last week of weather that we received across the state, as well as how precipitation has impacted our soils and what really is to come in the week or so ahead. Here's a hint, it's going to be a bit warmer, which I'm looking forward to personally. That and more's coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are ending this week's programming as we always do with this week's agricultural weather report. And for that, we're joined by K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. So Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start with kind of the past week, what we saw. Freezing temperatures for a lot of Kansas.
Yeah, we've been fairly warm to start the year, and finally Mother Nature came back and showed us that it's still winter. We've had temperatures, running around 15, 20 degrees below normal, especially to start the week. We saw temperatures as low as negative 11 up in the northwest. And so with that cold, it's a shock to the system, but it's good. We need to have cold air counter some of these warmer temperatures we've seen. That's climate for us, where we're going to bounce back and forth from extremes. And then, we're cold now. We won't be cold forever.
Yeah, and I guess in the next couple of days even, we can expect to warm up quite a bit, right?
Yeah, we've been gradually creeping our temperatures up through the week. We'll see temperatures for central and eastern part of the state reach the 60-degree mark possibly by the end of the weekend. And that'll persist for a few days. So a big change coming compared to what we were. That's about only a 40, 50-degree swing in a week. So there's some things to consider with that. But overall, we'll take it. We'll enjoy it while it lasts. And winter will probably revisit us again by the middle of the month.
Absolutely. That's Kansas for you, though, from what I'm quickly learning in my time in the state. So I know that we've experienced some wind, but even as we start to warm up, that's probably going to pick up even more with that, right?
Yeah, we've had breezy conditions, not significant wind by any means. We don't expect any significant wind, but continued breezy conditions with more southwesterly component to the wind. And unfortunately, that makes those days where the temperature is warm not overly pleasant to be outside, just because it's the wind chill factor and it doesn't feel nearly as warm as what it really is.
Sure. And with that, are we expecting any precipitation to come in as we think about, our forecast in the next week ahead for the state? What really can we expect there?
So I'll add one more thing about that wind. We haven't had precipitation for the last week and a half for much of the state. A lot of people have been out burning piles. So what that does is with these warmer, drier conditions and windy conditions, we need to check those piles. We need to make sure that the fires are out and they don't spread, because they will hold heat for a long time, and we have dormant grass across the landscape that can carry fire. So when we look into the forecast going ahead, we do have a chance of moisture midweek next week. I'm not overly optimistic that many people will get a decent amount. The highest confidence in the southeast, where they can see about 2/10 of an inch of rain, and it'll be warm enough for rain. And the rest of the moisture will go off to our south and east. And that's going to be the pattern for the next coming weeks, where we're still in kind of a La Nina type pattern with a little bit of kind of pseudo Spirit River type event further south. And that'll take moisture to our south and east and kind of keep Kansas high and dry for the most part. There's definitely a possibility that we can see that trend further north, but right now it doesn't seem to be very, very confident that'll happen.
Sure, and that's kind of been the trend that we've been used to during this drought period, right? It's either far north of us or far south, so that's just going to continue here.
Yeah, when we look at the drought monitor as a United States, Kansas is really the central part of the drought and the worst conditions in the United States right now. Got a lot of improvement to our north and south and east and west, and we'll see how that carries over. And it is important to note that a lot of places did see above normal moisture in January, especially the areas in the eastern and northern parts of the state. And that wasn't enough to wipe out drought completely, but it did bring some improvement. But overall, long-term drought's continuing, and the fact that these patterns are still setting up around us and not over us means that we'll keep this drought for a while.
Sure. You mentioned that we've had above normal precipitation for most of the month of January, but that it really hasn't allowed for those soils to really take in all of that moisture fully, right?
Yeah, the precipitation was mostly rainfall in central and eastern parts of the state, and as a result, a lot of that hit on frozen ground at times and led to runoff. Our ground just doesn't absorb moisture very well, and especially without snow cover, we freeze that ground really effectively. So the surface might not be frozen, but subsurface, it's colder, and therefore it's harder for water to flow through there. And as a result, more erosion, not great improvements in the soil moisture profile, and then the soil can freeze. Whereas further north and west, we really had steady soil temperatures, are right at or just below freezing. The snow cover insulates that soil and prevents it from completely freezing, and that moisture, as that snow melts, is then better absorbed into the ground.
Sure. Well, Chip, as always, thank you so much for this update today. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond joining us for this week's Agricultural Weather Report. We'll be back with more next week on Agriculture Today.